The morning started like any other at Elmwood High. The familiar buzz of students filling the hallways, backpacks slung over shoulders, and the muffled sound of sneakers squeaking against the polished floors created an ordinary backdrop. But for 15-year-old Tiana Marshall, today was anything but ordinary. She walked into school with her head held high, her confidence unshaken despite the whispers that followed her every move. Tiana was bright, talented, and determined, a shining example of what hard work and perseverance could achieve. But to some, she was just a target. The principal, Mr. Harrington, had been running Elmwood High with an iron fist for years. Known for his stern demeanor and zero-tolerance policies, his decisions were rarely questioned. But there was another side to him, a side that few dared to speak about openly, a bias that seemed to influence his every move. Today, that bias would come to light in a way no one could have imagined. Tiana had been called to the principal's office during her second period class. She walked in, unsure of what to expect, but her heart sank when she saw the look on Mr. Harrington's face. He didn't ask her to sit. Instead, he stood tall behind his desk, arms crossed, his eyes cold and unyielding. Without preamble, he delivered the shocking news. She was being expelled. "You violated the school's code of conduct," he said, his tone sharp and final. Tiana was stunned. "But I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice trembling but firm. She tried to defend herself, pointing out that there was no evidence, no explanation, no justification for this decision. But Mr. Harrington wasn't listening. To him, her words didn't matter. As Tiana walked out of the office, tears stinging her eyes, the whispers grew louder. News traveled fast in high school, and soon everyone knew. Some of her classmates shot her sympathetic looks, but others smirked, satisfied to see her brought low. Tiana had always been an overachiever, someone who dared to dream beyond the limitations others tried to place on her. And now it seemed she was being punished for it. But what Mr. Harrington didn't know was that this moment was about to change everything for both of them. Outside the school, as Tiana sat on the steps trying to compose herself, a stranger approached her. Dressed in a sharp suit and carrying a briefcase, the man introduced himself as Mr. Reynolds, a civil rights attorney. He had overheard part of the commotion, and after a brief conversation with Tiana, knew there was more to this story than met the eye. Meanwhile, back in his office, Mr. Harrington was feeling triumphant. To him, this was just another day of asserting his authority. But as the minutes ticked by, a sense of unease began to creep in. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and emails, each one more alarming than the last. Parents were calling, community leaders were demanding answers, and someone had already posted a video of Tiana's tearful exit online. The story was spreading like wildfire, and it wasn't painting him in a flattering light. Unbeknownst to Mr. Harrington, a storm was brewing, a storm that would expose his true nature and leave his carefully curated reputation in ruins. And as the clock ticked on, he had no idea that karma was about to come knocking in a way he would never forget. "Would you like me to continue or refine this further?" As the day wore on, Tiana's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anger. How could this be happening? She had never been the troublemaker. She was the student who stayed after school to help others, the one who raised her hand in every class, the one who always worked hard to make her parents proud. Her grades were impeccable, her behavior spotless. So, what had changed? What had she done to deserve this? Her mother, Marissa, was furious when she received the news. She immediately left work to meet her daughter at the school, her mind racing with questions. How could a principal expel a student without even offering a chance for explanation? She had known Tiana's heart and soul since the day she was born. This wasn't the girl who got into trouble. Marissa had spent years teaching her daughter to stand up for what was right, to not back down when things weren't fair. And this wasn't fair. Marissa arrived at Elmwood High, storming through the doors with a look of determination. She wasn't about to let anyone, especially Mr. Harrington, get away with this. As she marched towards the principal's office, she felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew how these things worked. She had seen it all before. How people in power could bend the rules when it suited them, how they could silence voices that needed to be heard. But she wasn't going to let that happen to her daughter. Inside the office, Mr. Harrington sat behind his desk, trying his best to look composed, but there was a nervous edge in his demeanor. He hadn't expected this level of backlash. He hadn't expected Tiana's expulsion to make it this far so quickly. But what was done was done. He told himself it was just a matter of time before everything would calm down. After all, it wasn't like anyone could challenge his authority. He had too much power in this town, too many allies who owed him favors. But when Marissa stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted. There was a calmness in her voice, but it was a calm that radiated strength. "I want an explanation," she said, not bothering to sit down. "What exactly is the reason my daughter has been expelled?" Mr. Harrington hesitated for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, as if the answer was obvious. "She violated the school's code of conduct," he said, his words clipped and final. "You should know better than to question my decision." Marissa's fists clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "You've known my daughter for years, Mr. Harrington. She's never caused trouble before. So tell me, what exactly is this violation?" The principal shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could feel the walls closing in, but he refused to back down. "It's not for you to understand. The decision is final." Marissa's eyes narrowed. "You're not giving me a straight answer, Mr. Harrington, and I'm not leaving this office until you do." For a moment, the room was silent. The tension was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Mr. Harrington was beginning to realize that this wasn't just some simple disagreement. Something much larger was at play, and he wasn't entirely sure how to handle it. Back in the hallway, Tiana sat alone, feeling a sense of numbness settling over her. Her mother's anger was the only thing that kept her going right now. She had always known that her mom would fight for her, but even now, Tiana wasn't sure what the next step would be. How could she get her life back on track when everything seemed to be falling apart? It wasn't long before the door to the principal's office opened, and her mother emerged, her expression unreadable. Tiana stood up immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mom," she asked, her voice shaky. Marissa looked at her daughter, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "We're not letting this go," she said, her tone steady. "This isn't over." Tiana could feel a small sense of relief wash over her. Her mother had a way of making everything seem like it would be okay, even when it didn't feel like it. But as they turned to leave, Tiana couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the principal's decision that had unsettled her, it was something else. The way he had looked at her, the way he had dismissed her so easily. She didn't know what it was, but she knew there was more to this story than anyone was letting on. At the same time, Mr. Harrington sat in his office, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The phone calls kept coming, each one more urgent than the last. News outlets were starting to pick up the story, and social media had exploded with comments from outraged parents and students. He had never imagined things would spiral this far out of control, and yet he found himself tangled in a web he wasn't sure how to escape. Then the final blow came. An email appeared in his inbox, the subject line clear and to the point. Asterisk complaint filed against Principal Harrington. Discriminatory expulsion of student asterisk. The email was from none other than Mr. Reynolds, the civil rights lawyer who had spoken to Tiana earlier. Mr. Harrington's hands shook as he clicked open the message. "This is your formal notice that a lawsuit will be filed unless the expulsion is reversed immediately," it read. "We have evidence that proves your decision was not only unjust but also discriminatory. You will be hearing from us soon." The room seemed to close in on him as he sat back in his chair. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle difficult situations, to be in control of everything around him. But now, everything was slipping through his fingers. The power he had always relied on seemed suddenly fragile, like glass shattering under the pressure. And as the day turned to night, Mr. Harrington realized just how wrong he had been. He thought he could get away with silencing Tiana, thought he could sweep the issue under the rug. But karma had a funny way of working, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Tomorrow would be a different day. But for now, he could only wait for the storm to hit. The next morning, the tension in the air at Elmwood High was palpable. It seemed like the entire school had heard about Tiana's expulsion, and the whispers were louder than ever. Students who had once ignored her or quietly admired her now stood in small groups, discussing her fate in hushed tones. Some were on her side, furious at what had happened, while others simply didn't know what to believe. The atmosphere had shifted. What had been a typical school day was now a battleground of opinions and rumors. Tiana walked into the school building, her heart heavy. It wasn't just the expulsion that was weighing on her, it was the sense of betrayal. She had always believed that this school was a place where she could thrive, a place where she wouldn't be judged for the color of her skin or the dreams she dared to chase. But now it felt like a system stacked against her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her books tightly to her chest, not knowing who to trust or where to turn. Marissa had already left for work after a long night of phone calls, determined to find a way to challenge the expulsion. But she hadn't given up on her daughter. She never would. She was already making plans to meet with Mr. Reynolds, the lawyer, to discuss how to move forward. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but it was a fight worth having. Tiana was worth it. At the same time, Principal Harrington was reeling from the mess he had created. His calm exterior was cracking under the pressure. He had spent years building a reputation of toughness and order, but now it was crumbling in front of him. His phone rang off the hook with calls from parents, reporters, and even alumni, all demanding answers. He had always prided himself on keeping things in line, on maintaining control of every situation. But this was different. The lawsuit hanging over his head was just the beginning. He had no idea how deep this problem could go. The pressure was starting to get to him. He had always prided himself on his ability to deal with problems quickly and decisively, but now he was paralyzed by fear. He could feel the walls closing in. The threat of a lawsuit was real, and the more he tried to bury it, the more it seemed to rise to the surface. He knew that his reputation was on the line, but what terrified him more was the growing sense that he couldn't get out of this. He had always been in control, always been the one to make the rules, but now he was facing a situation that might be bigger than him. Tiana's friends, too, were beginning to realize that their school had turned against her. They had seen the way she had been treated, and they weren't about to stay silent. Sierra, one of Tiana's closest friends, sat with her at lunch the next day, both of them fuming silently over the injustice. Sierra had known Tiana for years. They'd spent countless hours together studying, laughing, and even crying over the pressures of high school life. But this wasn't just about school anymore. This was about something deeper, something more sinister. "Can you believe this?" Sierra muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're just trying to get rid of you." "I can't believe they would do this to you, Tiana." Tiana looked at her, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said softly. "It's like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Like I don't belong here." Sierra shook her head, her eyes hardening with anger. "No, that's not it. You're smart. You're driven. You deserve to be here. They're just scared of you, Tiana. They're scared of what you represent." Tiana remained silent, absorbing her friend's words. There was a gnawing feeling deep inside her, a suspicion that what was happening wasn't just about a simple school rule. There was something bigger at play, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Across the hall, another subplot was unfolding. Mrs. Barnes, a teacher at Elmwood who had known Tiana since her freshman year, was struggling with her own conscience. She had always been a quiet supporter of Tiana, watching her grow from a shy, awkward girl into the confident, ambitious young woman she was now. Mrs. Barnes had seen firsthand how hard Tiana worked, how much she cared about her education and her future. But now, she was witnessing something she never thought she would see, a student she admired being treated like this. Mrs. Barnes had always believed in fairness. She had always believed that the school system was supposed to help students, to give them the tools they needed to succeed. But this felt like an attack on everything she stood for. She had seen the way Mr. Harrington treated students, particularly those from minority backgrounds, with a kind of cold indifference. She had seen how he was quick to punish, slow to listen, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that something. That afternoon, Mrs. Barnes walked down the hallway, her mind racing. She had to do something. She couldn't sit by and watch as this injustice unfolded. As she reached the teacher's lounge, she overheard a conversation between two of her colleagues. They were discussing Tiana's expulsion, but their words were far from supportive. "She probably did something to deserve it," one of them said. "She always thought she was better than the rest of us." Mrs. Barnes felt her stomach twist. It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the attitude behind them. The casual dismissal of Tiana, as if she was nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. She knew this kind of thinking wasn't new at Elmwood High. It had been there for years, simmering beneath the surface, always just out of sight but never truly gone. The more Mrs. Barnes thought about it, the more determined she became. She couldn't remain silent anymore. She had to take a stand, even if it meant going against the very system she had been a part of for so long. Back in her office, Mr. Harrington paced restlessly. His thoughts were all over the place, his mind scrambling for a way out. His phone rang again, but he didn't even check the caller ID this time. He was too distracted, too desperate. What had seemed like a small issue just days ago was now a full-blown crisis, and he was in the eye of the storm. He had always believed he could control everything, but this was beyond his grasp. And as he sat down at his desk, staring at the mountain of messages and the looming threat of a lawsuit, he knew there was no turning back now. Something had snapped, and there was no telling how far the repercussions would go. In that moment, Mr. Harrington realized he had underestimated one crucial thing. Karma had a way of catching up with people, and it was about to ruin his life in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. As the days passed, the tension around Tiana's expulsion only grew. News of her case had spread beyond the walls of Elmwood High. Parents, students, and even alumni were discussing it in every corner of the community. It was no longer just about one student. It was about the school's reputation, the fairness of its leadership, and the deep-seated issues of discrimination that many had overlooked for years. Everyone had an opinion, but none of them were willing to settle for an easy answer. Tiana stayed home, her mind consumed with fear, confusion, and uncertainty. She was no longer a student at Elmwood. She had been erased from the system in an instant, her future hanging in the balance. Her mother, though fierce and determined, couldn't shield her from the emotional toll this was taking. Every day felt like a battle, every phone call, every letter, every email filled with more frustration and questions. But Tiana was beginning to see something. She was beginning to see that this wasn't just her fight anymore, it was bigger than that. She had always wanted to stand out, to prove herself, but now she realized that what she was really up against wasn't just a principle, it was a system, an old, flawed system that needed to be challenged. And if she didn't speak up now, if she didn't do something, who would? Meanwhile, Mr. Harrington's life was spiraling into chaos. The weight of the mounting pressure seemed to be crushing him from all sides. His carefully crafted image of the unshakable principal was crumbling. His colleagues were starting to whisper behind his back. Parents were organizing meetings to demand his resignation. Even the school board, who had once trusted his leadership, was beginning to question his decisions. Every day, it felt like the walls were closing in a little more. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. His reputation was at risk, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. He had built his entire career on the belief that he was in control, that no one could touch him. But now, every step he took felt like a mistake, every conversation with his superiors a potential trap. Then, one afternoon, the phone call came that pushed him to the edge. It was from the school district's legal team. They had reviewed the situation and were concerned. The lawsuit filed by Mr. Reynolds, the civil rights attorney, wasn't just a legal nuisance, it was a serious threat. If things didn't get resolved quickly, the district could find itself in the middle of a public scandal that could affect not only Elmwood High, but the entire district's reputation. "Mr. Harrington, we need to talk," the voice on the other end of the line said, sharp and direct. "This isn't going away. You need to come up with a solution, and you need to do it now." As he hung up the phone, his hands were shaking. His stomach churned with anxiety. He had always believed that by maintaining order, he would hold onto power. But now, everything was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Tiana wasn't the only one growing more determined. Mrs. Barnes had spent the past few days speaking with her colleagues, gathering information, and quietly organizing support. She had already spoken with a few teachers who were willing to back Tiana up. She wasn't ready to go public yet, but she could feel the shift in the air. More and more, people were starting to question the fairness of the system, and how much of it was based on an unspoken bias that had been allowed to fester unchecked for years. She knew that Tiana's case was just the beginning. It was the spark that could set off a chain reaction, a chance to finally bring the truth to light. But it was also risky. Speaking out meant putting everything on the line, including her own career. But Mrs. Barnes couldn't stand by anymore. She had seen enough. She had seen how Tiana had been treated, and she knew deep down that the system had failed her. On the morning of the school board meeting, the tension was palpable. The atmosphere at Elmwood was thick with anticipation. Students, teachers, and parents filled the auditorium, each person eager to have their voice heard. Tiana's mother was sitting near the front, her expression steely as she prepared for the fight of her life. She had spoken to Mr. Reynolds again that morning, and the lawyer had made it clear that this was just the beginning. If they didn't get answers here, they would take this fight to court, and no one in the district would be able to hide from the truth. Tiana, too, was in the room, though she felt like a small figure in the sea of people. She had come to listen, to understand how this would unfold. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew this was the moment that would shape her future. And then Mr. Harrington stepped into the room. The crowd's chatter hushed as he made his way to the front. He tried to hold himself tall, his usual confidence faltering under the weight of the stairs. He could feel the eyes on him, the judgment in the air. The people who had once respected him now saw him as the villain in this story, and he could feel their disapproval like a tangible force. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. The school board members began the meeting, asking questions, but their eyes kept drifting back to Mr. Harrington. There was a sharpness to their gaze, a tension that was hard to ignore. It was clear they were already concerned about how this situation had escalated. When it was time for the public comments, Marissa stood up first. Her voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it that made everyone in the room pay attention. "My daughter has been unfairly treated," she began. "She was expelled for reasons that no one has been able to explain to us. She's a model student. She's worked harder than anyone to get where she is, and now she's been punished for something that doesn't make sense." Tiana watched from the back of the room, her heart racing. She had never heard her mother speak like this before, so fiercely, so determined. Marissa continued, detailing everything that had happened, and with each word, the tension in the room grew. The school board members exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel the weight of the accusations, and the truth was beginning to sink in. And then, just as Mr. Harrington was about to speak, the doors of the room burst open. It was Mrs. Barnes. She had come to stand up. She had come to expose the truth. The room fell into stunned silence as Mrs. Barnes stepped forward. She wasn't scheduled to speak, and her presence took everyone by surprise. She walked to the front with a quiet, resolute determination, her eyes locked onto Mr. Harrington. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her voice remained steady as she addressed the school board and the crowd. "I'm here today not just as a teacher, but as someone who can no longer stand by and pretend that everything is fine," Mrs. Barnes began, her voice carrying through the room. "What has happened to Tiana isn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger problem that has been ignored for far too long. The room was filled with a tense murmur as people exchanged confused glances. No one expected this. No one expected Mrs. Barnes to openly challenge the principal, to call out the very system that had always seemed unbreakable. "I've taught here for over a decade," she continued, her gaze never leaving Mr. Harrington. "And I've seen this school turn a blind eye to the needs of students like Tiana. Students who work hard, who show up every day, who give it their all, only to be met with an invisible ceiling that keeps them from advancing. This expulsion was not just an accident, it was a symptom of a much larger issue." Tiana could hardly believe what she was hearing. Mrs. Barnes was taking a huge risk by speaking out like this. If she was going to lose everything she had worked for, if she was going to put her career on the line, she was doing it for Tiana. And in that moment, Tiana realized something crucial. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every student who had been overlooked, dismissed, or held back because of the system they had no control over. But as Mrs. Barnes spoke, Mr. Harrington's face went pale. He stood up abruptly, his voice cracking as he tried to interrupt. "This is inappropriate," he said, trying to regain control of the room. "Mrs. Barnes, you're overstepping." But Mrs. Barnes wasn't done. "No, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice rising, cutting through his protests. "What's inappropriate is the way you've treated students like Tiana. What's inappropriate is how you've used your power to control and manipulate the system to suit your own agenda. You've hurt more people than you know." The school board members were now looking at each other, unsure of how to handle this situation. Some appeared uncomfortable, others seemed shocked, but all were paying close attention. Mrs. Barnes' words were cutting to the heart of something bigger, something none of them had fully realized until now. The stakes were no longer just about a single expulsion. They were about the culture of fear, bias, and inequality that had been allowed to thrive under the principal's rule. Tiana's hands were trembling as she watched the scene unfold. She had always known that something wasn't right, but hearing someone she trusted speak the truth so boldly was a revelation. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Could this really be happening? Could this moment be the beginning of real change? Just as she thought the confrontation had reached its peak, the doors to the back of the auditorium opened again. This time, it wasn't another teacher or student walking in. It was someone none of them had expected. Detective Miller, a local officer who had been investigating reports of misconduct at the school, entered the room. Tiana's breath caught in her throat. The presence of law enforcement at a school board meeting wasn't common. Something serious was about to happen. The detective stepped up to the podium, and a hush fell over the room as everyone turned to face him. He glanced at Mr. Harrington, then addressed the board. "I'm afraid I have information that changes everything," Detective Miller said. "We've received several complaints from parents and students about the treatment of certain students at Elmwood High. I've been investigating these claims for weeks. What I'm about to share is not just hearsay, it's evidence." Tiana felt her pulse quicken. What evidence? What was happening now? The shock on Mr. Harrington's face was undeniable. The normally composed principal was visibly rattled. His eyes darted around the room, his mind racing to figure out what was coming next. The detective continued, "We've uncovered multiple instances of discriminatory behavior and actions that were swept under the rug. We've identified patterns where students, particularly students of color, have been unfairly targeted or excluded. In Tiana's case, it appears that her expulsion was not only unjust, but part of a larger scheme to silence those who question the status quo." The room was frozen in disbelief. The words hung in the air like a bombshell, shaking the foundations of the entire school. Tiana's heart was racing, but she felt a glimmer of hope. Could this really be the moment where everything changed? Detective Miller pulled out a file and handed it to the school board, revealing a series of documents, emails, and records that painted a damning picture of Mr. Harrington's actions over the years. The room was filled with gasps as people began to piece together the extent of what had been happening behind closed doors. "I've seen enough," the detective said, turning his gaze toward Mr. Harrington. "The evidence speaks for itself. We have already started the process of filing charges. You'll be facing an investigation, and if the findings hold, this could lead to criminal charges." Mr. Harrington's face turned white. For the first time, he was speechless. His reputation, his career, his entire life's work was unraveling before his eyes. He had always been able to control situations, to maintain power through intimidation and manipulation. But now it was all crashing down. And yet, even as the walls closed in around him, there was a part of him that didn't fully grasp what was happening. He was still holding on to the hope that somehow he could fix it, that he could control the narrative, as he always had. But the truth was out now, and there was no going back. As the detective's words sunk in, Tiana felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth had finally been revealed. Her fight wasn't over, but this was the turning point. Her expulsion, her mother's determination, Mrs. Barnes' courage, everything had led to this moment. But there was one thing Tiana knew for sure: the story wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would shake the very foundations of the school and its leadership. The real battle was about to begin. The room was still, every eye locked on Detective Miller as he finished speaking. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, suffocating the tension that had been building for weeks. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Everyone was waiting for Mr. Harrington's response, wondering how he would handle the truth now that it was undeniable. But he stood there, paralyzed, his face drained of color. He had no answers, no excuses left. Tiana's heart raced, a mixture of relief and anger flooding her. Relief because she had fought so hard to get to this point, and anger because of everything she had suffered in the meantime. This moment was years in the making, and now it was all coming to light. The school board members looked at each other, stunned by the evidence that had been laid out. There was no denying it anymore. Mr. Harrington's reign of control was over. The system that had allowed him to intimidate, manipulate, and marginalize students like Tiana was about to be dismantled. One by one, the board members began speaking, their voices firm with the weight of the decision before them. "We will begin an immediate investigation into these allegations," one of the board members said, his voice steady. "Effective immediately, Mr. Harrington will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this inquiry. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked." A murmur of approval swept through the room. Tiana's chest tightened as she felt a strange sense of finality settle over her. This was it. This was the victory she had been fighting for. But even as the relief started to wash over her, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still off, something she hadn't seen yet. Mr. Harrington's eyes flicked back and forth between the school board and the detective. His mouth opened, then closed, as if searching for something, anything, to salvage his position. But no words came. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Tiana looked to her mother, whose expression was a mix of triumph and exhaustion. This was their moment, the moment they had both fought for, but it didn't feel as satisfying as Tiana had imagined. Something was missing. Just as the meeting was wrapping up, another figure entered the room, and the door slammed behind them. Tiana's eyes widened as she recognized who it was. It was Tiana's old friend, Joda, who had graduated a year before. She had been the one to help Tiana navigate the confusing social and political landscape at Elmwood. Tiana had always respected Jada's strength, and now seeing her here, in the middle of this moment, Tiana couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was something urgent in her presence. Wait. Joda called out, rushing to the front of the room, looking panicked. I have something important to say." The school board paused, their attention shifting from the conclusion of the meeting to Jada's unexpected interruption. "What is it, Jada?" one of the board members asked, sensing the urgency in her voice. Jada turned to face Tiana, her eyes wide with fear. "Tiana, you have to know something," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to say anything before, but now I have to. There's something you don't know about Mr. Harrington." Tiana froze. Her mind raced as she tried to process Jada's words. What could she possibly mean? Everything had been laid out. They had just won. What else could there possibly be? Jada, what are you talking about? Tiana asked, stepping forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Jada's breath hitched as she glanced around the room nervously. It's not just Mr. Harrington. There's someone else, someone in the district who's been covering up everything. I didn't know the full extent until recently, but I found out that the corruption doesn't end with him. There's a higher power involved. Tiana's blood ran cold. The room felt like it was spinning as Jada's words sank in. She had thought they had finally broken the system, but now she was being told there was more to it. How could that be? Who else was involved? Jada hesitated, as if unsure of how much to reveal, but then she spoke, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. It's the superintendent, Dr. Walters. I didn't realize it before, but after everything that's happened with you, Tiana, I started looking into things more. Dr. Walters has been protecting Harrington for years, covering up the worst of it. The board didn't know half of what was going on. They've been kept in the dark. The bombshell hit hard. Tiana felt as if the floor had been pulled out from under her. Dr. Walters, the person who had always been a figure of authority, the one who had smiled and waved at every event, was at the center of the web of lies. Tiana's mind spun as she tried to understand what this meant for her, and for everyone else who had been wronged by the school's administration. Are you sure about this? One of the board members asked, visibly shaken. How do you know? Jada pulled out her phone, showing them a series of texts and emails, documents she had gathered over the past few weeks. There was undeniable proof, undeniable connections. Dr. Walters had been involved in covering up Mr. Harrington's actions, and in some cases had even pushed for decisions that had hurt students like Tiana. As the room descended into chaos, with board members and others frantically trying to digest this new information, Tiana stood frozen in place. It wasn't over. The fight wasn't finished. There were deeper layers to the corruption than she had ever imagined. She had thought this meeting would end with the closure she so desperately needed, but now the battle had just taken on a whole new level. Tiana had won the first round, but the real fight was only just beginning. She looked over at Mrs. Barnes, who was staring at Jada with a mixture of disbelief and determination. Tiana felt the surge of determination welling up inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been ignored. She had fought for herself, but now she had to fight for everyone else too. And as the room descended into confusion, with everyone scrambling to understand the full scope of the revelations, Tiana knew one thing for certain. This fight would not end here. It had just begun. The room buzzed with shock as Jada's revelations sank in. The board members were visibly shaken, some whispering to one another, others pulling out their phones to verify what they had just been told. Detective Miller stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. Now that we know the full extent of this situation, it's time to take action, he said, his voice firm. We'll launch a full investigation into Dr. Walters and anyone else involved in this cover-up. This is far from over. Tiana stood in the center of the storm, her heart racing, but she could feel the strength growing within her. What had started as an effort to right a personal wrong had turned into a battle for justice, for everyone who had ever been overlooked, misjudged, or silenced by the system. The fight wasn't just for her anymore, it was for all of them. As the meeting continued, the tension slowly began to dissipate. The school board, now fully aware of the depth of the corruption, was no longer defending the system that had allowed Mr. Harrington and Dr. Walters to flourish unchecked. They were now focused on finding the truth, cleaning up the mess that had been made, and ensuring that the students would no longer be victims of the same broken system. The detective made it clear that legal actions would be taken. Mr. Harrington and Dr. Walters would both be placed under investigation, and with the evidence now in hand, it was only a matter of time before their actions were fully exposed. The news spread quickly, and soon stories of the scandal began to make their way into local headlines. For Tiana, the weight of it all was overwhelming. It was hard to believe that everything had come to this. What had started as a single moment of injustice against her had snowballed into something much larger. But as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had supported her, she realized that it wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for all the students who had been silenced, overlooked, and wronged by a broken system. Her mother stood by her side, her eyes filled with pride and relief. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it was finally over. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Dr. Walters and the school district grew more intense. Evidence continued to surface, and many more voices were raised in support of the students who had been hurt by the corrupt administration. The truth was undeniable now, and the community began to rally behind the students who had suffered. Tiana, though, still felt a deep sense of disbelief. She had never imagined that this battle would become so much bigger than her. What had begun as a fight to clear her name, to make sure she wasn't forgotten, had evolved into a movement for change. Her own life slowly began to return to normal. She was reinstated at school, her expulsion overturned, but the experience had forever changed her. She had found her voice, and that voice had become a beacon for others. Tiana no longer felt invisible, she felt empowered. Mrs. Barnes remained a close ally throughout the process, and Tiana found herself looking up to her more than ever. It wasn't just Mrs. Barnes' courage that inspired her, but her wisdom. She had always been a teacher who believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences, and now Tiana understood that lesson more than ever. As time passed, the school district underwent a massive overhaul. New policies were put in place to prevent the same injustices from happening again. The superintendent, Dr. Walters, was removed from her position, and the school board began working to ensure that every student, regardless of their race, background, or socioeconomic status, would have an equal opportunity to succeed. Tiana became an advocate, using her platform to speak out against injustice in education. She spoke at community events, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up for themselves. Her words resonated with many, and soon Tiana became a voice for those who had long been ignored. She never let the fire inside her burn out. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she was ready for it. As for Mr. Harrington, his fall from grace was swift and brutal. His once powerful position crumbled under the weight of the scandal, and soon it was revealed that he had been involved in numerous unethical practices over the years. He was arrested, tried, and convicted on charges related to his abuse of power. But even as he faced the consequences of his actions, Tiana didn't feel vindicated in the way she had expected. In the end, it wasn't about seeing him punished. It was about seeing the system he had manipulated begin to heal. It was about making sure that no student, no matter their background, would ever have to face the same battles she had. Her journey had taught her something invaluable, that even in the darkest moments, there was hope. She had learned the importance of speaking up, of not staying silent in the face of injustice, and while the fight for equality and fairness in education was far from over, Tiana knew that she had made a difference. As the months passed, Tiana looked back at everything she had been through. The anger, the hurt, the frustration, it all seemed like it happened in another lifetime. She had become a different person, stronger, more determined, and more aware of the power of her own voice. And when she walked through the halls of Elmwood High again, it wasn't as the girl who had been silenced. It was as someone who had stood up for herself and for others, and had won. Tiana smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. The fight was far from over, but she had won the first battle, and that was enough to keep pushing forward. The world may not have been perfect, but with people like her and Mrs. Barnes, there was hope for change, and that was all that mattered. As she walked out of the school on a sunny afternoon, Tiana knew that the story wasn't over. The next chapter was just beginning.